is from Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 15. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other. Just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must be forgiven. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, and which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in the one body, and be thankful.
To invite you to stand as you are able for our gospel reading. This is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. Let's listen to God's word. Then Peter came and said to him, being Jesus, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you, 70 times 7. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wishes to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began that reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, his Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and his children and all of his possessions, and payment to be made. And so the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, pay what you owe. And then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, saying, have patience with me, and I will pay you. But he refused. And then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. Now, when his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed. And they went and they reported to their Lord all that had taken place. And then his Lord summoned him and said to him, you wicked slave, I forgave you all of that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or your sister from your heart. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
And you may be seated. Well, we are in the 4th week of a sermon series entitled Life Together, One Another and One Another. And we're looking at this series of one another commands in the Bible in this series. We began with the foundational command to love one another, which occurs some 16 times in the Bible. Then we talked about encouraging one another the following week. And last week we talked about bearing with one another and making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. Today, however, we are probably going to deal with the toughest of all of the one another's. Forgive one another. Lewis Smedes, in his excellent little book entitled Forgive and Forget, says that, quote, forgiving is love's toughest work. That is so true. Forgiving is love's toughest work. Let us face it, revenge and hatred, not forgiveness, are our natural responses when we have been hurt by another person, whether it's in the church or outside of it. Maybe you've heard the old country western song, which says, when the phone doesn't ring, darling, you'll know that's me not calling. Yes. We want the other person to suffer, and just as we are suffering, don't we? we find it nearly impossible, most of us, not to replay time and again in our heads and in our hearts the offense against us and our desire, our plans for revenge to make things right. And this is true wherever that hurt happens, in the church, in the family, in the workplace. Pain is pain wherever it happens. And yet the dangers of not forgiving are even greater than the difficulties of forgiving. Someone once said that not forgiving is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Indeed, the bitterness and the hatred that we feel towards others are like poison to our souls. They block our relationship with God. They corrode our inner joy. They spoil our peace. They stress our bodies. And in the end, they shorten our lives. There's a Chinese proverb that has it exactly right. The one, it says, who pursues revenge ought to dig 2 graves. One for the one you're going to seek revenge on, and one for yourself. This, I believe, is the reason that Jesus uses such harsh language at the end of Matthew chapter 18. It is not so much that Jesus believes that God is going to actually torture those who do not forgive, but rather it is to stress the fact that choosing not to forgive is to, in fact, choose a torturous life, a life of torment. To continually rehearse a catalog of hurts and plans for revenge is, in fact, torture. It is hell on earth. And so the first reason that we forgive is for ourselves. Lewis Smedes again said, you forgive somebody and you begin to dance instead of to wallow. You begin to walk with God. You set a prisoner free, and you discover that the prisoner you set free is yourself. So forgiveness is ultimately a selfish act. It is in our self-interest to forgive, and that's okay. Nobody deserves to suffer in unforgiveness. But when the hurt happens in the church, I think there's another reason to forgive, and that is because we love and care for and want the body of Christ to succeed. Indeed, just as bitterness and anger will seep through and spoil and destroy the human body, so it also will destroy the body of Christ. Every church consultant in the world, for instance, will tell you that the number one impediment to church growth is unresolved conflict. If a church has unresolved conflict, it will not grow. When people don't love one another in the church, then they don't have the energy to expend in ministry. Instead, they're expending it on maintaining the conflict. Now, please note that it is unresolved conflict, not conflict in general, that kills the church. Conflict in the church is normal and is to be expected, and in fact most experts will tell you it's actually a healthy thing. There's a problem when nobody ever says anything to anybody else. Something's wrong there and the church isn't going to improve itself. Conflict is normal. Even Paul, the great missionary, and Barnabas, the great encourager that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, had a falling out. And the writers of the New Testament were honest and wise enough to include the story of that conflict in Scripture so that we would know that good people, good Christian people, disagree. But the early church is also full of stories of people working through their conflict and forgiving one another, just as we ourselves should forgive one another, just as we have been forgiven by the Lord. And indeed, that is the church's secret weapon, our arsenal against the anger and the bitterness of unforgiveness. Our forgiveness from God. Because when we fully grasp how much God has forgiven us, then our hearts cannot help but be softened and have a new power to forgive. The parable of the unforgiving servant in Matthew chapter 18, for instance, Jesus says that the first man owed his master 10,000 talents. Now, if any of you would take the time to read your little Bible's footnotes to figure out how much a talent is, you would discover that one talent was worth about 15 years of wages. 15 years of wages is one talent, and we're talking 10,000 talents. So if you figure that the average U.S. income is about $42,000, which is what Google says right now per person, that calculates to a debt of, are you ready here? $6.3 million in modern terms. $6.3 million, friends, and you thought your credit card balance was scary, right? But that's what Jesus is saying to us about how much we owe to God. After all, God so loved the world, right, that He gave us His only begotten Son. And yet our response was to crucify the Lord of life. And every time we are cruel and hateful and mean-spirited towards another human being, we participate in the ongoing crucifixion of Jesus in the world. We have done this. And when we truly understand the depth of our sin and the immensity of God's grace towards us, then we begin to see other people's sin against us in a new perspective. So the second servant in the parable owes the first servant 100 denarii. Now again, let's do our little currency conversion here. 100 denarii is about 100 days' wages, so you multiply that out, again using the same approximate numbers that we've been using from Google. That comes out to be about $12,000 in modern terms. Now $12,000 is no small sum, admittedly. Jesus isn't saying that our hurt and our pain isn't real. He isn't taking that for granted and saying, oh, don't worry about it, it's nothing at all. Yet, $12,000 is nowhere near 6.3 million, is it, dear friends? Not even in the same ballpark. And so Ephesians 4 commands us, forgive as freely as you have been, as the Lord has forgiven you. So, we forgive one another. Because not forgiving is dangerous. Because we love the church and want it to be effective in mission and ministry. Because we realize how much we ourselves have been forgiven. But how do we forgive? I mean, on a pragmatic basis, how is it that we go about forgiving in the church and in the world? Well, the Bible has guidance for this also. First of all, according to the Bible, we need to keep a short list. Keep a short list of your resentments towards others. Ephesians 4:29 says, be angry, but do not sin. In other words, you're going to be angry. That's normal, that's healthy, that's fine. But don't let the sun go down on your anger. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. I believe I shared a couple years ago a story about a husband and a wife that were having an argument one morning. It was breakfast, and they had their breakfast. They kept bickering and fighting with one another, and it was time for the woman to leave, and so she asked her husband if he would zip up her dress, and he was just so angry at her that he just grabbed that zipper on her dress and went zip, 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 zip. Ooh. And she went out the door with that. And all day long she was just fuming and fussing and repeating this, and she just couldn't believe that he would do something so provocative and so thoughtless to her. And so she came home, she saw their car in the driveway, and she saw her husband under the car there, working under the car, and the little light bulb went off in her head, you know, and so she went up and to her husband and grabbed his belt buckle right like that, and grabbed his zipper and went zip, 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 like that. And then she kind of triumphantly, you know, stomped off and went on into the kitchen. And there she discovered her husband. Sitting there peacefully having his cup of coffee. And she turned ashen white he said, "Honey, did you meet our new neighbor? Isn't it great? He came over to take a look at that oil leak in the car." Don't let that happen to you. Don't let that happen to you. Keep a short list of your anger and your resentments. You should have called them sometime during that day and tried to work out and express your feelings. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. Don't fume all day. Don't let resentments grow into big, ginormous trees of anger and hatred. Instead, says the Bible, try to talk it out. Again, Jesus has some words of advice here. In fact, immediately before Peter gives his, how many times do I have to forgive my church member question, immediately prior to that, the thing that prompted that question is this statement from Jesus. If another member of the church sins against you, and notice that Jesus assumes that that's going to happen. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. And if the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you're not listened to, take one or two brothers along with you, or others along with you. In other words, our first response to hurt ought to be that we go and we try to talk it out with the person, one-on-one, face-to-face, person-to-person. I've learned over the years, don't try to do it by email. It just doesn't work. I'm sorry if I've done that to you. Hopefully that one-on-one, face-to-face conversation works, but if it doesn't, then the Bible tells us to take a wise soul, a caring person along with us, a neutral party who might help to intercede and help the two to work it out. Lord willing, that third party will help bring about reconciliation and reestablish peace. Another part of forgiving is to own up to our part in the conflict. So let's be honest here, rarely are there innocents in conflict, because rarely during conflict are any of us at our best. We're almost always on the defensive. We're almost always reacting from that primitive part of our brain instead of the best part of our brain, aren't we? And sometimes the sad truth is we just screw up in life. Sometimes we just make really, really big mistakes. And this is just as true for pastors and for their families as it is for your average Joe church member and their family. I know that I've made mistakes here at St. Paul, and I'm sorry for that. Quite honestly, I'm guessing that it won't be the last time. I still may make one or two more. But I'm trying to own up to them, and I'm trying to do better. And indeed, we all have to own up to them. We all have to try to do better. Once we've owned our sin, we need to ask for forgiveness, and we ought not to be timid. I'm sorry. I really blew it. I apologize. I made an incredible mistake. I was unthinking. I was uncaring. I'm sorry. And then, if you're the person receiving the apology, we need to tell the other person, we do need to tell the other person that they are forgiven. There are no more healing words in the world than, I accept your apology. That says that we're done here, or at least we've started the healing process. I accept your apology. I forgive you. It's okay, I understand. No sarcasm allowed here, by the way. You notice what Jesus says at the end of Matthew 18? He says, you must forgive right from your heart. Okay? You can't, oh yeah, sure, I forgive you. You can't do that. That's not right. So that's how it's supposed to work, right? That's how it's supposed to work, especially in the church. That's how it's supposed to work. But what do we do when things don't go according to plan? I mean, what do we do when things get all botched up? What do we do when the process isn't followed? What do we do, for instance, when the other person won't apologize? Perhaps they don't think that they did anything wrong. Or what do we do when the other person can't apologize? Maybe they're dead. Or maybe they live at a great distance and you can't communicate with them. What do we do when the apology isn't complete incomplete, or maybe it's half-hearted, or they only accept partial responsibility, and you still don't see eye to eye with that person. What do we do when there's been a whole lot of time, months and months, since the event actually happened, and you can't even remember exactly what happened in the instance? I mean, after all, the further we are removed time-wise from the event, the more it is human nature to paint ourselves, right, as the innocent and the other person as the villain. The more time passes, the more clearly we see things, right? Or what do we do when we just aren't sure that it's worth the emotional pain to dig it up again? When we're afraid that the hurt or the trauma will continue, that it'll just make it worse? Or what do we do when the rift involves multiple parties and some of them have apologized, but others of them haven't apologized? In other words, what do we do when things are a mess? As quite honestly, so often they are in life. We forgive anyone. Go back to reason number one for forgiveness. We forgive for ourselves, to set ourselves free from the toxic emotions that poison our souls when we don't forgive. It is wonderful. It is glorious when the other person apologizes and when we have that moment of coming together. But forgiveness, Christian forgiveness, is never dependent upon the other person apologizing or somehow this perfect process being followed. We forgive as the Lord has forgiven you, we read in Colossians. So how does the Lord forgive you? How does the Lord forgive us? Think of Jesus on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Jesus didn't wait for an apology. He simply forgave. And if we want to be His disciples, then we have to walk in His footsteps. And He gives us the power to walk in His footsteps. That's hard. That's killer hard, isn't it? But remember that forgiveness is a process. Okay? Don't expect it all to be just warm fuzzies immediately. It takes time. I think that's why Jesus said that we must forgive 70 times 7 times, or 77 times, depending on what translation you believe. Let's say 70 times 7. I think that's probably a better translation. See, I don't think that Jesus is saying that we have to let our neighbor walk all over us 490 times, or an infinite number of times. The call to forgive is not the call to be a doormat. It's not an invitation to be abused time and again by other people. I don't believe that's what Jesus is getting at. No, what I think that Jesus is saying here is that He understands all too well that when we encounter that other person, or when we think about that other person, or the transgression that has happened, He is aware that it will come back, those feelings, again and again and again and again. And every time those feelings come back, Jesus is saying, I think that we have to offer those up as a prayer to the Lord. And say, God, I am so angry yet again, and yet I'm asking you to help me to forgive this other person. And one last thing that helps me to forgive when things are messy, and that is to remember that actions speak louder than words. Think about it. In almost every sphere of human life, we recognize that this is a great truth, don't we? Right? When it comes to your husband or your spouse or your children, sometimes, they have a hard time saying the words, but we know that they love us, right? But somehow, when it comes to forgiveness, we feel like we can't move on without the words. They haven't apologized. And it gnaws at us. In Rebecca's family, for instance, her parents almost never said that they were sorry. This was especially true of her father. Now, who knows why that was? I don't know. Perhaps his parents never admitted mistakes. He came from a German family. You know, German families, they just don't do emotions, right? Maybe he just lacked the ego strength to admit that he had made a mistake. But Jack, for whatever reason, would never apologize to Rebecca. But he would be extra nice for 2 or 3 days after the transgression occurred. And that was his way, however imperfect it was, and indeed it is imperfect. That was his way of saying, I'm sorry. Do we really always need words? I mean, in a perfect world, we would all sit down and have a kumbaya moment every time a transgression occurred, in the church or in our families or wherever. But I don't know whether you've noticed it or not, but it seems a little clear to me that we don't live in a perfect world and there's no perfect people in it. And if someone acts kindly towards us, if they act with good intentions, if they do something that says, I care about you, doesn't that often speak more loudly than words? That they realize that mistakes were made and that they want the relationship to be restored? I think it does. Not perfect, but good enough. Forgiving is indeed love's toughest work. I think that this is true. Forgiving is also love's best work. It is the very reason that Jesus came. It is the thing that sets Christianity apart, this radical forgiveness from all other world religions. Because when we forgive, we set ourselves free. We set the church free to be the church, and we set others free along the way. We end the vicious cycle of hurt and of retaliation, and we open the doors to the possibility of a true peace for ourselves and for others. Every Sunday, pray this prayer that Jesus taught us. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. May this be our prayer today. May this be our prayer.